right now. Hello, everyone. Today I have a very special guest, Mr. Jeff Bell. Today, Jeff Bell is a radio host, author, and awesome mental health advocate who I've had the honor of hearing speak several times. And I thought, you know what? We need to have him on, and you all need to hear his story because it's very inspiring. So, welcome to Jeff Bell. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you, Lauren. I'm thrilled to be chatting with you tonight, and it's great to be a part of this project you're working on.
Thank you. So I thought to start off, I would just have you kind of talk about your story on how you came to reach your diagnosis and reaching out for help, and um, kind of talk about what your experiences were, and yeah, just to start.
Sure. So I took a very circuitous journey to get to mental health advocacy, and it sort of grew out of necessity. I was undiagnosed, living with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, for a whole bunch of years. My earliest childhood memories are actually of what I now know to be OCD. Had no idea back in those days that the ruminating I was doing was actually part of a clinical diagnosed or undiagnosed disorder.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm going to kind of fast forward my story to my late 20s. And this is when adult onset OCD kicked in a big way. And I remember to this day very clearly the very first episode I had as an adult that told me something was off. I had been invited to go to a 49ers playoff game in San Francisco. And a friend of mine had tickets, and I was very excited about this. And I rushed to the stadium after work, and I was too cheap to pay the whatever it was going to be to park in the actual stadium parking lot. So I parked about a mile away in a neighborhood and started walking to the stadium. And about halfway there, this thought popped into my head: what if you didn't set the parking brake in your car?
Mhm.
And it was one of those kind of ridiculous thoughts because it's not like I had not done that before. I had no reason to second guess myself, but the thought was very disturbing. And so I turned around and walked back to my car about a half mile. And I looked in the window and I saw that the parking brake was set, and I felt much better. Started walking back to the stadium, about halfway back, maximum inconvenience. The thought pops in my mind again that, well, you looked inside the car, but you didn't actually feel the brake, the parking brake, to make sure that it was in the upright position. And I thought, well, this is ridiculous. I looked at it, and this voice of doubt that I've come to call my doubt bully said to me, well, you're never going to be able to enjoy the game if you don't really know that the car is safe. So I walked back again. And the long and the short of it is, I missed the whole first quarter of this playoff football game that I was so excited about. And I couldn't understand why I was acting so irrationally. One of the hallmarks of OCD is that those of us who battle it are acutely and painfully aware of how nonsensical our intrusive thoughts are and our rituals that we develop to try to dislodge those thoughts. And I'll share a little bit more as I go through my story. But that's the first adult memory I have of dealing with what I now know was an OCD obsession and compulsion. The obsession was what if, as most obsessions are. It starts off with what if. And in this case, the what if question was, what if the car rolls away? And that quickly ratcheted up to, what if the car rolls over somebody? And that ratcheted up to, what if the car rolled over somebody and somebody became seriously hurt or was killed? All these horrific images and horrific thoughts started springing from that initial obsession. And that thought was so disturbing that I did something to try to get rid of the uncertainty around that intrusive thought. And that was to go back and check. That is the obsessive compulsive cycle. A what if question that becomes an intrusive thought that gets very stuck in one's head. And the response to that, usually a very debilitating response because it becomes ritualistic, to try to rid oneself of the discomfort of the uncertainty, which of course is the dog chasing its tail. So from there, Lauren, it just continued to spiral out of control, my OCD. This is my late 20s. Started checking and rechecking and rechecking everything in my life, whether it was if I had unplugged appliances, whether I had locked doors, whether I had actually put a check in the envelope when I was sending off a mortgage payment. Check, 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 check. And in every case, I found myself thinking, I don't get this. This seems very irrational, even to me. But I had no idea what was going on.
Yeah.
So I went to see, very reluctantly, a psychologist. And that was a huge thing for me because of stigma. I know that your organization is working so hard to help break down stigma. And I love that, because stigma was a huge deal for me. I could not imagine what would happen to me if people in my world found out that I had seen a psychologist. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was a scary, scary thing. Um, I would have never anticipated that you and I would be having this conversation all these years later, that I'd be talking openly about it. At that stage, I wanted no one to know about it. So I went to see a psychologist, and we did this little dance for a few sessions. And I told him what I was comfortable telling him, which was next to nothing, because I didn't want it to wind up on his legal pad and in my permanent record someplace. So I shared a little bit, and I couldn't really articulate very well what was going on either. But he was very quick to come up with a diagnosis, which was interesting in retrospect. He said, I think you have a fear of success. Because I told him about my kind of fast track career in broadcasting, and having married my college sweetheart and having a child at home and everything being in a perfect situation, except for this anxiety I was dealing with. He said, you have a fear of success. And I'm thinking of psychiatric hangups, go, yeah, it sounds like a pretty noble one. I'll go with that. So I left after about 4 sessions, knowing that I had not really accomplished anything there. Tried to soldier on, but life continued just to spiral out of control, because I just kept checking and rechecking everything, having no idea what was going on. Went to see a second psychologist. Again, very fixated on what would happen if word got out, but I knew I needed help. And this psychologist, whom I've affectionately dubbed Dr. How Does That Make You Feel in one of my books that I've written, was a traditional psychotherapist. And I have nothing against psychotherapy. It's a wonderful tool in our mental health tool chest, but for OCD, it is not the frontline approach. And Dr. Y didn't know that. I'm sorry, I call her Dr. Y in the book, and have nicknamed her Dr. How Does That Make You Feel? I would go into her office week after week, and I would tell her about these ridiculous things I was doing, like driving my car in circles every time I ran over a pothole in the road to go back and check to make sure I hadn't run somebody over. And I would tell her about these things, and whatever I would tell her, she would lean across the table between us and say, well, how does that make you feel? Frustrated, anxious, embarrassed. But we did this dance week after week, where I would tell her about what I now know to be my OCD, and she would ask me how it made me feel in a very, again, what's the word I'm looking for here? Well, a talk therapy kind of way. And again, talk therapy, great, just not the approach that we're looking for with OCD. So Dr. Wyatt and I had sessions for several months, and then she inadvertently stumbled across a treatment process that worked very well. She took vacation because while she was gone, my inner investigative reporter took over, and I went to work trying to figure out what was going on. And I remember so clearly, Lauren, I was in a bookstore and very fixated that no one would see me in the psychology section of a bookstore. But there I was going through the stacks, and nothing seemed to speak to me. I was not battling postpartum depression or loss of a loved one. And then this one book all but jumped off the shelf, and it was called The Boy Who Couldn't Stop Washing. And interestingly, hand washing was not a challenge for me at that particular juncture. It came later. But something about the words couldn't stop, that spoke to the compulsion aspect of what was going on in my life. I couldn't stop checking everything. And so I pulled this book off the shelf and I started reading it. And the more I read, the more I broke down and cried, because I realized for the first time in my life 3 things. 1, I'm not the only person who does this. I'm not the only person driving my car in circles. I'm not the only person checking and rechecking my doors and appliances. And there was great comfort in knowing that. The second thing was, this challenge of mine has a name: OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, the doubting disease. And 3, and most importantly, there's a treatment process for it.
So I have
And
a
so,
question. Oh, sorry. I have a question for you about that.
Yeah.
Some people like have different opinions on labels and things like that. But what I'm kind of hearing you say about your experience with that is knowing and kind of having what some might call a label. That was actually a sense of relief for you because then you can know, like if you were to go see a doctor again, or you were to go see, it was kind of almost like, oh, this has a name. Whereas other people might have a different experience with that, but for you, because you knew something was wrong, but then that was kind of just even knowing what it was called and having that, what some might call a label, it kind of had the opposite effect. It was like, oh, that was such a relief. Like you felt,
Yes. And that's a great point because we all have a different relationship with labels. And one thing I've learned over the years in my advocacy is to avoid referring to myself as an obsessive compulsive. That does not define me. OCD does not define me. I do say I'm somebody who has battled and continues to battle OCD.
Mhm.
So for me, there is that distinction between letting the label define me and using the label as a way of articulating what my challenges are
Yeah.
and getting myself in the right treatment bucket, if you will.
Yeah.
Because it's a great question, Lauren, and that led to my getting the right treatment. Because once I found that book and discovered myself in that book, I was able to reach out to the International OCD Foundation and start getting the treatment that I needed because I had a label that fit, a diagnosis that fit. And I've always considered myself very fortunate. Mental illness, as you know, can have many, many layers to it.
Yeah.
Mine was pretty clear cut. I mean, I've been fortunate in that I have had a clearly diagnosable disorder with a treatment process attached to it. And I'm grateful for that because not everybody has had something quite that cut and dried in terms of what that challenge is.
All right, yeah. Yeah, I think that it's kind of like to kind of like touching on what you're saying, like it's all, I think we're all individuals and like everybody has their own like individual thing that they connect to. And I know for me, I've had books. I'm a huge reader and like for me, I've had books that I've read. I deal with personally like learning challenges, and I read a book that had a mother and a daughter, and the daughter had a learning disability, and I kind of had a similar experience where I was like reading and I was just like, she had a lot of similar challenges to me, so I know exactly how that feels of just like knowing you're not alone. So I can relate to that for sure. So going on from there, after you kind of had that initial realization and you read that book and you made the connection, what happened after that as far as seeking out? And you said you reached out to the foundation. What when you reached out to them, um, how did they like respond to you, and how did that feel for you reaching out to somebody that like had a specific focus on that and understood maybe more specifically what you were going through?
Yeah, it was so cathartic, but scary. Scary as all get out. I mean, I remember that first phone call where I kind of stumbled my way through the questions about, how do I get treatment and so forth. And a very nice, comforting woman on the other end of the line walked me through the options, walked me through treatment options, and helped me connect with a local therapist. And, excuse me, it's interesting. One of the things, Lauren, that I've learned from that experience is I went back to Dr. Y, as I call her in my book, and I shared with her what I had learned. And she looked at me and said, OC what? I said,
Mm,
OCD. And she said, "No, I haven't heard of that one." Now, this is going back a bunch of years right now, to be fair.
yeah.
OCD was not part of our vernacular the way it is today. But I have heard from a lot of people over the years that they had similar experiences where they were either misdiagnosed or a diagnosis was missed, as in it wasn't discovered at all. And Dr. Y, to her benefit, I mean, I'm sorry, to her credit, called me the next day and said that she had talked to some colleagues and that I was right to be exploring what I'm exploring. But I shared that as part of my mental health advocacy because it's so important for us to get the correct help and find ourselves in the right care, and we have to be our own advocates. So to answer your question, I I called the IOCDF, which in those days was the Obsessive Compulsive Foundation back on the East Coast. They helped me connect with the local therapist in the Bay Area, and I was able to start doing the treatment that got me well. I mean, I'd love to be able to tell you that it happened overnight or even quickly. It was a long, circuitous path because OCD treatment is very difficult, as is most treatment in the mental health world. In the case of OCD, the treatment process is something called cognitive behavioral therapy, and
Myself.
specifically, you're familiar with that?
I've done CBT personally, so
Okay.
I know from firsthand experience.
Yeah, and it's a really powerful tool, and
Yeah,
CBT teaches us to recognize thought distortions
yeah.
and to address our black and white thinking or catastrophizing, all these thought distortions that can really get in the way of our mental health. Um, and for the OCD community, there's a particular practice that falls under the umbrella of CBT called ERP. This sounds like alphabet soup here, but ERP is exposure response prevention. And
Mhm.
this is a way of systematically learning to sit with anxiety. And so for somebody with challenges around checking, for example, the exposure is, perhaps having to leave a house without checking that the toaster has been unplugged. It's very triggering for us, but we learn that we don't necessarily need to do the compulsions that we think we do to reduce the anxiety. And let me just give you one quick metaphor or for the OCD treatment itself. I love this. This is from a wonderful book called Freeing Your Child from OCD by Dr. Tamara Chansky. And she talks about the fact that when we're young kids, we get in a cold swimming pool
Mhm.
and the water is really cold, but we're kids and we splash around and the water warms up. Well, the water didn't really warm up, right? What happened? We got used to it. We acclimated to it. We habituated to it. And the whole crux of OCD ERP therapy is learning to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty,
Mm.
because that discomfort dissipates all on its own if we allow it to, if we allow ourselves to habituate to it. Those of us with OCD, though, tend not to think we can habituate to something. So we keep getting out of the pool, if you will, of that discomfort um, before we have a chance to acclimate to the anxiety. And when I talk about getting out of the pool, I mean, we do compulsions because we think that that's going to relieve the anxiety, when in fact it only does momentarily. There's a quick payoff, but we start chasing our tail. So the good news about OCD treatment, because I do want to put this out there in terms of the hope, um, it is a very treatable disorder. I mean, that is the good news about OCD. The bad news, it's hard work, but if you are willing to do the hard work, and if you work with a professional therapist, and in some cases, if you work with a pharmacologist in a conjunction with your therapist, there are medications out there that can help sort of reduce the volume of the intrusive thoughts. And I have seen so many people, Lauren, myself included, really benefit from these therapies, and lives are turned around. So that's the hope I always want to put out there for people with OCD.
I have a couple questions on what you just touched on. You kind of, I feel like, alluded to it a little bit, but does, like, in the those who have OCD, do their specific um, compulsions, do they all look the same, or are there different?
Thank you for asking that question, because it's a really important one. Oftentimes, people see depictions of somebody scrubbing their hands, right? They might have germ contamination issues, either about contaminating other people or getting themselves contaminated, and they'll scrub their hands. I mean, that's a very common depiction of OCD, right? It's
Yeah.
one we can all see, and most people can somewhat relate to some degree. There's checking, like I described for you, where I went back and checked garage doors and appliances and so forth, another very common flavor of OCD. But there are easily a half dozen to a dozen um, pretty cookie cutter like flavors of OCD. They can be counting, they can be ordering, um, patterns. There are all kinds of ways that people are developing rituals to try to dislodge the discomfort of the uncertainty. In every case, though, the rituals are always these efforts that we take to try to rid ourselves of the discomfort of anxiety. So that's the common thread for all the OCD patterns. But yes, there are many forms of compulsions and there are many forms of obsessions. The treatment for almost all of those different forms is, again, the CBT with the ERP.
And something I also wanted to ask you about, and then we'll move on to talking about A2A. But when you were talking about the hand washing, I kind of wanted to, we touched on it, I feel like a little bit. But in your own personal experience and just what you see out in, like, I guess, society, with the way people use language and just how sometimes there's just really a lack of understanding with, I would say, the OCD, but also just mental health in general. I was wondering if you could talk about, like, how when people, they just use, like, I think OCD is one of the
Mhm.
more common ones. And if you could just kind of like give your thoughts and just like touch on that a little bit of like the stigma. I think language is a big part, but just your thoughts on that and what maybe as people who are trying to help um, combat that, what maybe we could do both with OCD and just in general.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate the question, Lauren. It's such an important one. I think one of the most read blog posts I've ever made was one called OCD is not an adjective. And this was years ago, when the term itself started entering the vernacular, often in a very incorrect fashion. We've all heard friends say, oh, my boyfriend is so OCD about cleaning his car, or my daughter is OCD about doing her homework. What they mean is that individual is probably fastidious or anal retentive. Um, these are terms that are adjectives. OCD is not an adjective, it's a disorder. It's an obsessive compulsive disorder. It's not a personality trait, it's a disorder. And so the individual who is scrubbing their car over and over again, it might be that that individual has OCD, but it might also be that that individual just really likes a clean car,
Yeah.
without having the disorder part of it. And so it's great that people are more aware of the term OCD. Unfortunately, it's misused so often. And I think people in my community, if you will, the OCD community, feel like it really diminishes what they're going through when they say, oh yeah, we've all, friends will say, oh yeah, we've all got a touch of that OCD. Boy, just the other day I couldn't stop cleaning my apartment because it was so messy, or whatever the case might be. um, Again, personality traits can be challenging for people, but OCD as a disorder is something that, we know through brain imaging that the OCD brain, if you will, is both structurally and functionally different from the non-OCD brain. And that's why it is so difficult for those of us who deal with the disorder, to recover from the worst of it. That's why the professional help is so necessary. So yeah, again, bringing it back to your question, it used to frustrate me a lot when I heard people using it incorrectly. I've kind of come to appreciate those opportunities to help create a dialogue. And so I will try to gently, without insulting somebody, say, oh gosh, you know what? Are you aware that OCD is actually a clinically diagnosed disorder? And here's how it differs from somebody just being fastidious and so forth.
Yeah, that's I think that's a really good way to approach it because then you can help them come along and be kind of like on your side, so to speak, and maybe become an advocate. Because sometimes people, especially when you hear something like that all the time, you don't even sometimes think about what you're saying. And then and you, like you're saying, you don't want to be like, oh, you do, like, have a calm about it and try to like educate them. I think that's really important because then they might be like, oh, and they can continue to learn more about it. I think that's really important. And I think we need to definitely be willing to do that. That's a good reminder for sure. So now I want to talk about when I've heard you talk before, you kind of touched upon kind of your philosophy about helping others and how that helps you also, and how it's like mutually beneficial to reach out to people. So I kind of, and you founded your organization, which I don't think it's called Adversity to Advocacy. And so I was wondering if you could first kind of tell me about how you were led to start that and then how it kind of progressed and then um, yeah, just go from there.
Sure. Kind of a wild story. In 1997, I was at my wit's end. I had been through 5 therapists and I had been on and off medications, and I had read every book that there was to read about OCD. And I wound up in my backyard, was living in Sacramento at the time, and I was in my backyard hammock. And I remember staring up at the mighty heavens and saying just out loud to no one or anything in particular, show me how to turn around this crazy world. I'm sorry, show me how to turn around this crazy life, and I will share my story with anyone who will listen. I remember thinking, well, where did that come from? But in retrospect, it was sort of a plea to the universe, if you will, help. I'm at my wit's end here, and nothing magical happened at all in the wake of that bargain with the universe, as I've come to call it. But I sort of turned that bargain on its head, and I said, you know what? I am in a good position to share my story. I'm somebody who's comfortable with public speaking. I work in the radio industry. I've always considered myself a storyteller. I could be very effective talking about getting better from OCD. Only one small problem: I have no story to share.
Mm.
And so I kind of put the proverbial cart before the horse, and I said, I'm going to get better so I can tell a story and help other people. And I've come to call that a greater good goal. And I've written about that extensively. And that's been a big part of my advocacy over the years, is what I call greater good motivation. In retrospect, I know that that's what it was. I set a goal that was bigger than myself, something that would enhance my own sense of purpose
Yeah.
and be of service to other people. And fast forwarding the story, I spent a year journaling and getting professional help during that, by the way. Nothing magical happened, but I went back to my therapist, whom I had dismissed because she wasn't fixing me, not
Mm.
realizing that I wasn't doing my part.
Yeah.
And I went back with a new motivation, which was to get better so I could help other people. Um, and I spent a year doing that, and I journaled about it. And then I spent another year writing a very bad first draft of my first book. And then I spent 9 more years rewriting that book. And bottom line, 10 years after that bargain with the universe, I published my first book, and I went public with my story. And I went overnight from 5 people in my whole world knowing what was going on with me to the whole world who cared knowing about me. And it was so frightening. But what surprised me was how empowering it was.
Mm.
I found that the more advocacy I did, I started sharing my story in TV interviews and radio interviews and at various speaking opportunities. The more I got out there and shared my story, the stronger I got. And I became fascinated by that process, that we help ourselves by helping others. And I'm hardly the first person who has stumbled upon that adage. It's true. I mean, it goes back to ancient philosophy. But I stumbled across it for myself and found a wonderful motivating tool there, which was we help ourselves by helping others. And
Yeah.
I wrote a second book about that. And then I started finding that there were a number of people in my world that I was coming across in advocacy that didn't have OCD, maybe not even mental illness. Maybe they were dealing with a physical challenge or a life challenge.
Yeah.
And yet they were finding that same principle, Lauren, that if we do something constructive to help other people, we draw a great sense of purpose and benefit ourselves. And through that process, I came to found A2A, the Adversity to Advocacy Alliance. And we're, gosh, coming up on 10 years now.
Awesome. Yay.
Yeah, I know. It's so exciting. And basically, we share stories. We
Yeah.
encourage people to, share their stories, even anonymously. We have a program called Project Hope Exchange, through which people can leave an anonymous message just to taste what advocacy is like and to taste that benefit that you get when you do something constructive with your challenges to help other people with similar challenges. And then there's the story component of it. You were mentioning that you find it so helpful to read, about people who have challenges similar to your own that you've dealt with over the years. I have shared that. There is a commonality there, regardless of the challenge, that there's something so powerful about the shared connection of story, that
Yeah.
that's something we try to provide opportunities for through A2A as well.
Yeah. I remember. So I know you from community college psych club. And
Yeah.
I remember also there was other people, I forget their names, but I remember their faces and just kind of like, and sometimes there were certain like circumstances with like physical or disabilities that people would share about that I didn't even like know about. So it was just really cool to like not only just hear the personal, but also, oh, I'll look into that and just see like what you were saying. I think it's incredible how, yeah, the specific things might differ, but we're all human beings that are, you know, wanting to, I think wanting to thrive. And, you know, I think that's just really really, really awesome. Like, and it's really inspiring to me as somebody who I am getting my degree in psychology and I'm wanting to like get into that field personally. I'm
Yay.
actually graduating in May. I'm almost done.
Congratulations.
Yeah, I'm super excited.
Yay.
So I want to work with kids specifically, but I think like, you know, we're all human beings and, you know, even though we might come from different backgrounds or ages, I think that we're all, there's more in common. And I think right now it's really hard for people to remember that. But I think that's one of the things I remember going to your website and being like, oh, this is so, so cool. So yeah, I'm really glad that A2A exists. And like I said at the beginning, you're a great inspiration. Just how you're very open about it. And I know that you've helped a lot of people. So um,
Thank you, Lauren. I appreciate
yeah.
that.
So I guess we'll, one final note. If you have any, two parts, if you have any like final things you want to say to people who are struggling. And I also thought that it would be good to like maybe have a word towards people who are wanting to get into advocacy. Like if you can maybe say a few words about those two things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And thank you for both opportunities. So let me start at the narrowest point, which would be people who might be watching or listening that have OCD.
Mhm.
Um, there is a wonderful organization that I've referenced because it helped save my life. It did save my life.
Mhm.
It's now called the International OCD Foundation. The website is really easy to remember, iocdf.org, just International OCD Foundation, iocdf.org. Go there if you're looking for information. There are so many wonderful resources, right down to find a therapist tools where you can find somebody in your neighborhood or your city, your region that can help you get professional treatment. Please ask questions. You need to be your own advocate. That's so important. That's one of the lessons of my journey. You need to be your own advocate when you're seeking mental health treatment, but that's true regardless if it's OCD or anything else that fits under that umbrella. Ask questions, advocate for yourself, be courageous. It's scary to reach out for help, but I promise you that there are loving, caring people in your community that want to help you. When I say your community, I mean the community of people who share your challenge. You know, that's what advocacy is all about. So I encourage you to reach out for help. That's the first thing. The second thing, in terms of advocacy, there is this notion, and I battled this for a long time too, that I need to get better before I can start helping other people. I would submit that it's actually sort of the other way around. That I mean, obviously there is a base level. If you're in crisis, you need to take care of yourself first, obviously.
Yeah.
But during your recovery phase, there are people you can benefit in a great way by being there for them.
Yeah.
And in doing so, again, help yourself by helping others. I think you will find that you draw a great sense of purpose
Mhm.
that allows you to really build resilience. And that's what the A2A concept is all about, is that when we are recovering, as most of us are in life from something or whatever that might be in our lives, when we're able to reach out and do something constructive with what we've been through, we
Yeah.
draw great personal benefit. So it's the ultimate win-win. And so I encourage anybody who has an interest in advocacy but is feeling like they're not quite ready to be an advocate because they have not recovered well enough,
Mhm.
I would challenge that and say, if you're feeling called to start doing some work, find out ways to do it. Reach out to local nonprofit organizations or organizations that speak to you. If you want to taste advocacy in an anonymous way, please feel free to try out Project Hope Exchange. It's projecthopeexchange.com. That's an A2A project, and you can leave a 30-second message of hope and do it anonymously and just get a taste of what it feels like to do something constructive with what you've been through. But allow yourself to be vulnerable enough to connect with other people in the advocacy community, because I mean, that's what you and I are doing tonight, Lauren. We're a couple of advocates and we're sharing stories. And I mean, that's what this whole advocacy community is all about. We all help each other.
Yeah. So I also wanted to give you a chance. You mentioned you wrote a couple books. Do you want to plug them?
No. What kind of author doesn't want to plug his or her own business?
Or any other things that you want to mention? Is these are just the closing remarks. So anything else you want to mention or plug?
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. I will put out a couple of websites and a couple of names. I have written 2 books. My first book is called Rewind, Replay, Repeat. It is a memoir and kind of documents my journey to wellness. And if you're looking for a way to better understand what OCD is through the story of somebody else, that's one way to get at it, is to read a memoir. And mine is one of dozens of great memoirs out there these days that are really an opportunity to provide a window to this disorder. So there are a number of great memoirs out there that can provide that same thing. The second book, called When in Doubt, Make Belief, is my attempt to take the lessons I learned through my own journey and offer them to people who aren't necessarily dealing with OCD, but just dealing with everyday uncertainty. And it's very much about this notion that we help ourselves by helping others. And I lay out an approach I call the greater good perspective shift for decision making. And that shift is just a way of reframing our decision making from good versus bad to good versus greater good. And I try to explain that in detail in the book. So those are the 2 books. The nonprofit organization A2A, we can be found online at a2alliance.org, A, the number 2, the letter A, A2A, alliance.org. And Project Hope Exchange, projecthopeexchange.com.
You know what I just remembered? I actually have an autographed copy of your first book, because
Oh
I
my!
got it, and then I heard you talk. I was like, I'm one of those like book people that I'm like, if I know the author, I'm gonna have them sign it. So I appreciate it.
Well, I'm honored that you would want this autograph. So thank you very much.
Well,
And let me just say this in closing too, if I might. Kudos to you and your colleagues with this organization and the great work that you're doing. Breaking down the stigma, man, that's what this is all about.
yeah.
We need to get the message out there collectively. It's okay to talk about mental illness. It's okay to talk about these challenges.
Yeah.
I poked around your website. It looks like you guys are doing some great work. So congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Well, and thank you for taking the time to talk about it, your experiences and like what you do for the mental health community. I am always like inspired, like I said, and love hearing your story. So thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, Lauren. It was a pleasure.